Recently, I released a series of videos explaining all the components of a PC at a beginner level, and that was all in preparation for this video, which is explaining how to build a computer for someone who's never built one before. This video will go over the entire assembly from start to finish, including things like how to budget your parts, as well as some interactions between components not discussed in my earlier videos. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. As with most projects, the most important step is preparation. This goes even earlier than ordering your parts and laying out your tools. You'll have to start thinking about the purpose of your PC. Why are you building it? If it's primarily for gaming, you should set aside more of your budget for a GPU. If you're a video editor or graphics artist, you might want to lean more into your CPU and RAM. This video will be targeted towards a gaming PC since that's what we're going to be building. Even within gaming builds, however, certain games might draw more on components like your CPU more than your GPU, which would result in some adjustment of your budget if you know you're going to be playing those games in particular. If you aren't sure what you'll need for your games that you play, I would recommend just doing some Googling and trying to find out. To find parts within your budget, you can use a site that I've recommended in the past, pcpartpicker.com. I'm not affiliated with this site, but they do a great job of finding compatible parts and helping you sort by price to fit in your budget. I've used them for all the PC builds I've done in the past, and they've always helped a lot. Let's take a look at the budget for this build. I'm building a computer for my friend, and I was told to shop around the $1,000 mark, which I thought was very reasonable and provides a lot of flexibility. My friend told me that he wanted to play shooters and some RPGs, and so I went for a build that has a fair bit of balance between CPU and GPU, since it sounds like he'll be playing a fair mix of games. However, he also didn't have a gaming monitor, and I didn't think it made much sense to use this hardware that we would be buying without one. So with his permission, I included a 144Hz 1080p monitor in the $1,000 total. We could have easily stretched this money farther without that monitor being included, but for a beginner build, I think this is a great machine for around an $800 budget. I think it's a good rule of thumb to spend at least 50% of the budget on the GPU and CPU in total, and so I set those benchmarks for this build. The CPU is an Intel i5-9400. With 6 cores and a core clock of 2.9 GHz, this is a reasonable start for a beginner gaming build. Compared to similar models like the i5-8500 or the i5-9600, I think this is a good spot in price versus performance. In hindsight, I probably would look at the Ryzen 5 5600X, which is now at a similar price point, or if you can stretch your money a little further, look at the i5-9600K. These are all around the $200 price range. The GPU for this build is a GTX 1650, which is probably the best you're going to get at the $200 mark. If you don't need a monitor, you could bump up to a GTX 2060 or an off-brand 660 XT. I think that this is another good balance between price and performance, as well as being from a trusted brand. It's also available at the time of shooting, which is a good bonus and not always true of GPUs around this time. You might be asking why spend around only $400 on a CPU and a GPU and then $400 on the rest of the components. You'll see that the rest of these components do add up quickly in cost. I wanted to give the CPU and GPU some high quality infrastructure to run on and not be forced to skimp on a cheap motherboard or power supply. The rest of these parts will last a long time and can support upgrades should my friend choose to make them. Let's quickly run through the rest of the parts. A Gigabyte H310M micro ATX motherboard, which supports 32 GB of RAM, 4 SATA slots, a PCIe and 2 PCI slots, and a reasonable offering of I/O. It's about $100. 16 GB of DDR4 2666 RAM by G.Skill, which is the fastest our motherboard can support. For storage, we've gone with 1 TB of a 2.5-inch SSD by Team Group. It's a decent amount of storage, just for games, which is all that he said he needed. For $75, not bad. A power supply is the EVGA 80 Plus Bronze 600 watt, which is far in excess of what we needed, but it can support things like a GPU upgrade in the future. Could have gone a little bit more efficient, but for $55, I'm pretty happy. For a case, we've got the Cooler Master Q300L, and I've built in this case before and I like it a lot. For $70, it does have some quirks, but it serves me well and has a ton of space and airflow. Sort of an extra purchase I got was a Noctua LH L9i. You could use the stock cooler that comes with your CPU, but These Noctua coolers are the best in the industry, and I think they do look pretty cool. The last thing in the budget is a monitor. I wanted to go 1080p with a high refresh rate. This 24-inch MSI optics was a decent price, and so we went with that. You can find links to all these parts in the description below if you'd like to learn more. Now that you know what's going in it, we can move on to the actual installation of all these parts. In the spirit of being prepared, I like to gather my tools early. The most important thing you'll need is a big table or workspace like the one I'm at now. I suppose you could use the floor, but there's usually dirt and dust and static on the floor, which is bad. Next up, you'll need a screwdriver. I like this one by iFixit, which came with a bunch of bits, some tweezers, and some helpful pry tools. The bit I use throughout this whole build I think is called the number 1 bit. It's just a standard size you can find at pretty much any hardware store. Pretty much all you'll ever need for building a PC is a Phillips head. You may want to get an extended or flexible attachment for reaching deeper into the PC, especially if you know you'll have a big GPU or CPU cooler. It's also helpful to have a blade of some kind, whether it's a knife, scissors, box cutter, or whatever, just to open your packaging. One final tool you might want to consider is a headlamp or some kind of flashlight. The PC case, believe it or not, will block a lot of light, which makes it pretty tricky to work in. A lot of these parts are really small, and even if you're in a well-lit area, it can become hard to see the inside in these smaller connections. I think we should now be ready to start getting our parts out. I always start with the motherboard, and the reason for this is that you'll be plugging all your parts into the motherboard, and so you'll want it accessible. Additionally, the motherboard box gives you a good place to set your motherboard while you work on it. There is circuitry on the back of the motherboard, and you'll want to avoid damaging it, so you can use a non-conductive surface, like the motherboard box, to protect the back of the component. Unwrap it and set it on the box, like so. If you want a little more stability, you can flatten the box so that it sits flat on the table. You'll notice that there's a piece of plastic in the CPU slot. This is meant to protect the delicate hardware underneath it and is locked into place with this lever. I'll show you how to remove this in just a second, but just know that you'll need to keep this piece if you want to return your motherboard. You won't be able to return it without it, so keep track of it. The first thing to be installed should be the CPU. When you unbox it, be careful with the packaging so that you don't accidentally drop the CPU out of the plastic. Depending on the model you'll buy, you'll likely find a CPU cooler, the stock one, included with it. These are easy to install, but we actually won't be using that today, so you can set it aside. On that cooler, you'll find thermal paste, which is a compound used to form a conductive seal between your CPU and the heatsink of its cooler. Thermal paste helps the heatsink pull heat from the CPU, and then the fan moves that heat away from the heatsink in order to keep the CPU cool. If you look carefully, you might notice that I actually installed the RAM before installing the CPU on this build. I'm not really sure why, but I will show you how to install your RAM in just a minute. For now, we'll continue to look at the CPU. If you look carefully at the corner of the CPU, there will usually be a small triangle on one corner. If you look at the CPU socket or the cover on the CPU socket, there will be a similar triangle. You'll want to line these up to make sure your CPU is installed correctly. To put it in the slot, push down on the lever and move it away from the socket. It should come free and allow you to swing the hinge open that it's attached to. For now, don't worry about the plastic bit. We can see that the triangle is on the bottom right corner of the CPU socket or the CPU socket cover, so we'll line up the mark on the CPU up with that. Carefully lower it into place using only vertical motion and not wiggling it around or sliding it. You can see that if I wiggle it once it's in place, it doesn't move at all, which means it's properly locked in its socket. This hinge has a screw and a notch that helps lock it into place, so I'll slide it under there, giving it good downwards pressure, and you'll see that the plastic cover pops right off. If you keep pushing the lever down and back where it started, you'll have successfully installed your CPU. The part that you install next will really depend on the size of your CPU cooler. Sometimes if you install your cooler, it won't allow you the clearance to install your RAM, so it might be a good idea to get that out of the way now. For now, I'm going to continue with my cooler because I know that it will work with my RAM. If you're just using the stock cooler, it will have thermal paste already installed. Some aftermarket coolers will have it installed as well. You'll want to orient the cooler in a way that will allow your power cable to reach the CPU fan header, which is where the fan will plug in and get its power. This is usually located near the CPU socket and should look like 4 small pins. The Noctua cooler that I'll be installing will not have any thermal paste installed, but will have thermal paste included in the box that we'll apply. Here's just a quick unboxing of the Noctua cooler. I absolutely love the packaging included with these coolers. Let's start by installing thermal paste. I like to do an X pattern with 4 dots in each gap. I think it provides a good amount of coverage. To secure the cooler to the motherboard, we'll need to use the included bracket. It is a little tricky. You should probably start with the bracket and screws pre-placed in the motherboard from the back so that you can just tighten down the cooler that way. I opted to place the cooler, then flip the motherboard to more easily access the screws in the bracket. You can start by thumb tightening them and then break out the screwdriver to tighten them the rest of the way. You'll want to alternate diagonally, tightening screws so that this cooler is secured evenly. It's not all the way down on one side and then all the way down on the other. That would squish out some of your thermal paste, give you a bad fit. Finally, you can plug in the fan header, which should be close to the end of your cable. Now we can install the RAM, and this is pretty easy. Assuming that you've chosen the correct RAM for your motherboard, there should be a notch that will only allow you to install your RAM in one direction, one orientation. The RAM slots are next to the CPU socket, so find them and align your sticks according to the notch in the middle. Make sure the tabs on the end of the slots are open, then push down gently but firmly to seat the RAM in its slot. It's pretty easy to install, but very important to remember the RAM. You shouldn't force it in, and make sure that it's flush with the slot so that none of the metal pins are visible. You'll notice that I've got 2 sticks of RAM installed and both my RAM slots are occupied, giving me access to dual channel mode for my RAM. If you've got questions about this, check out my RAM video in the description. If your motherboard has 4 slots of RAM, you'll want to check out your motherboard manual to see what configuration you need to use in order to access dual channel RAM. Now we've got the CPU cooler, and the RAM installed. I'm actually going to break out the case now and start laying out our parts. The components we have yet to install are the GPU, power supply, and storage drives. I like to install the GPU once the motherboard is secured. I think it's a bit safer for the structure of the motherboard and its ports. You could install the power supply before this step and route some cables, but you can also use the motherboard layout to figure out where these things need to go. Kind of depends on your style. Let's proceed with the case unboxing and motherboard installation. I love this case because of its insane airflow. Basically, all the sides are covered in holes for ventilation and mesh screens to filter the dust out. We've got a large plastic panel to show off the internals as well, which is a nice touch. Keeping the plastic wrap on this plastic panel, we will remove it with these 4 screws, and then you can see the USB ports and power buttons on this panel here. You can actually unscrew this panel and move it around according to where you want it in your setup. It's currently installed on the side, and I think I move it to the top later on in the video. On the inside, you can see these standoffs, which are meant to separate the motherboard from the metal of the case. These are very important as they can prevent short circuits and damage on the back of the motherboard where those circuits are that we talked about earlier. If we lay out the motherboard, we can see that there are some standoffs installed already, but we need to add a couple more in order to fill all the holes of our motherboard. The standoffs can be twisted in by hand, and to install the I/O shield, push it in from the inside of the case until it clicks into place. Then you can tighten down the motherboard with the motherboard screws, which should be labeled in your case manual. After this, I moved the power button panel and routed the cables to the ports on the motherboard. Our case has a USB 3.0 header, and to install it, you'll note the place where a pin is missing. You want to match that up to the cable without a hole, and it should fit right into place. Next, we're going to install the headers for the power switch, LEDs, reset switch, and some of the indicator lights. These are pretty annoying to install and can prevent you from successfully turning on your PC the first time you try to do so if they're installed wrong. Take a close look at your motherboard manual and make sure each one is oriented correctly on those pins. They'll be even harder to install once the GPU and power supply are installed, which is why I think it's best to do it now. Next, we'll be adding the storage drive. We'll flip the case over and remove the back panel so we can access all the organizational features back there. We can cable manage here, as well as mount our hard drives on these holes here. Our case comes with these rubber grommets, which will go between the screws and the case where we attach the storage drive to reduce vibration and keep your drive safe. We'll use these screws with a spacer to hold the grommets in place so that we can install them, since normal screws won't hold them, they won't be long enough. These screws are also included with the case. You could install the drive on the back side to save space and give you an even cleaner look, but we do have room on the inside and I tend to like the look of storage drives, so we'll have it on the inside with the rest of the components. We'll connect the drive to the motherboard using SATA, which is this L-shaped connector. We'll supply it with power next after installing the power supply. But before that, we'll install the GPU, and to do so, we'll remove two of the covers for the PCIe slots, which will allow us to access the ports on the back of the GPU. I didn't show this part, but it's basically just two screws. You might have to bend the physical covers back and forth a few times in order to break them off if your case is more budget oriented. You just need to align the plugs on the back of the GPU to the slots on your PCIe slot. And usually installing the GPU in the top slot is best practice because this port usually has the highest bandwidth. To install your GPU, make sure that the locking tab on the PCIe slot is pulled back, then firmly push it towards the motherboard while perpendicular. Once it's fully installed, the locking tab should push back and click back into place. Normally, there is a power supply port on a GPU, but I was surprised to discover that this 1650 is efficient enough that it didn't even need external power. It gets enough power from the PCIe slot and doesn't need connection to the power supply, which is a pretty clean look. Finally, we can install the power supply. There are 4 screws included with the case that we'll use to secure the power supply. Once the power supply is flush with the case, we can begin routing cables and getting power to the components. We'll route a cable up to the CPU power slot, as well as the largest one to the 24-pin motherboard port. Finally, we'll get power to the storage drive, and after that, we can turn the case around and use some cable ties to keep things tidy back here. After that, your PC build is done. You can put your back panel on, but it's considered bad luck to put your front panel on before you've booted successfully. If you have more cooling solutions to add, that should have been done after we got the motherboard in, but this is a pretty open, low power build, so I didn't feel like we needed additional cooling. The only thing left to do is to add Windows, the operating system, which is not included on the drive we've already installed. All I have to do now is get a Windows 10 boot drive on this thumbstick that I have. To do that, we just need a working computer, and we can download the image of Windows 10 onto a USB stick. It will clear all the data on the stick, so make sure you don't need the things that are currently on it. You can find the Windows image just by Googling it or on the Windows website. And then you'll have to go through the setup process for Windows 10. To use it for free in an unregistered version, there will be a step that prompts you to enter a product key. At that step, just say you don't have a product key and Windows will install as an unregistered version. The only things you lose access to are customizing your home screen and other cosmetic features. That's really it. You can install programs and do the normal things that Windows 10 lets you do, all with an unregistered version. However, if that really bothers you, you can pay the couple $100 that it costs to officially license your Windows. Congratulations, you've officially built your first computer. I hope you found it to be fun. It's one of the things I enjoy most, and it's something I get a lot of joy out of. So I hope you've learned something from this video. If you'd like to check out the gear I used in this video to build the PC or the parts I use in my PC, check out the links in the description below. Thanks so much for watching till the end of this video. Subscribe if you're new and if you'd like to see more content like this. You can also comment to let me know what you thought of the video or if you have questions. I'd be happy to answer them. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you in the next video.